It's time for the Bible Geek.
Robert M. Christ. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not.
Holy Ghost.
God, Gnostic, God blasted my spine.
Ghost.
Yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Interpretation, Starhole, Jesus, homiletical, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's Bob the Bible Geek Price, Robert M. Price, with you this evening. Actually, it's about 9:30 here on the 21st of April, if that makes any difference. And ready to tackle some questions. Just want to thank everybody who has donated to the Patreon page. Keep up the good work, and I will too. Mighty gratifying knowing there's that kind of interest in my stuff. Well, let's see. How about some rain barrel questions? Salutations, Geeky One. This is from Monk MC. Just curious about the extra-biblical mythologies surrounding Roman soldiers, namely Longinus and Tiberius Pantera. Where do these come from, and is there a reason why? Are there others? Longinus was the name legend gave to the Roman centurion who, and I think he's like, what they did was to take the guy from John who harpoons Jesus in the side, causing blood and water to come out, and they combined him, as I say, with the centurion in Mark and Matthew, who sees how Jesus dies, none of the stabbing stuff, and says, this man was the Son of God. Or in Luke, it's toned down a bit. This was a righteous man. And, well, naturally, legend being as creative as it is, decided these must be the same guy. Same way they decided Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, and the sinful woman of Luke 7 were the same. You know how that goes. They figured that this guy must have... his confession of faith in Jesus must have been tied up with his having stabbed Jesus in the side, as improbable as that is, but it kind of works out because they decided that the blood ran down the spear shaft into the eyes of the centurion who had been blind. That seems a little, what should we say, implausible, and but at any rate, it was like I once was blind, but now I see. You know, Paul's allegorical blindness in Acts 9, and that of the man born blind, who once he sees now can see that Jesus is the Son of Man, etc. In John 9, same idea here. Now, where did they get the name? Certainly no gospel calls him Longinus or anything else. Well, Longinus means spear in Latin, or lance, or javelin. So he is what Todorov, the great Russian formalist critic, called a narrative man, who is scarcely a character at all. He is just fulfilling a narrative function needed in a particular scenario. He appears again, strangely enough, in the Acts of Paul, where he's one of the Roman soldiers guarding Paul in Nero's presence, and they've just borrowed him. Now, Pantera, as you might guess, that means the same thing as panther. It was a common Roman nickname for soldiers, and it's like saying, Richard the Lion-Hearted. And or witness the modern superhero, the Black Panther. And this comes from Jewish counter-gospel legends, such as you find in the Toledo of Yeshu, where they call Jesus the fatherless, or as I prefer to translate it, that bastard. And this seems to be a parody of the Christian virgin birth claim. Oh, Joseph wasn't his father? Oh, I can believe that. But who was? Well, maybe it was a guy named Pantera because of a pun on Parthenos, Greek for virgin. Some people think that's unnecessary, and indeed, you can never know about these things for sure, but that seems to me to be a pretty good guess. It was so commonly bruited about, as they say. The 4th century Bishop of Salamis, Epiphanius, who wrote a huge book against heresies and stuff, he said that there was a Pandera in the genealogy of Jesus. Ben Pandera, son of Pandera, as he was called. Well, maybe he was. It just didn't have the nasty associations. Let's see. There are other people like Saint Veronica, who appears in Passion narratives, not in the Bible though. Veronica is the same as, that's the Latin version of the Greek name Bernice, and it comes ultimately from Pherenike, she who bears away the victory, like an Olympic athlete or a warrior queen or something. She who bears away the victory, who carries it away, she seizes the victory. But it was understood like one of these Old Testament etymological puns, where they named him Moses because he was drawn out of the Nile, assuming that Moses must be based on a Hebrew word. How about masha, to draw out of, when in fact it was begotten. It was half an Egyptian name, like Tutmos. Thoth has begotten him, etc. Let's see. In the same way, they took Veronica to mean true image, right? Icon and Verus, though that's a little bit, it's kind of like Brian Lumley's Kathat Aqua Dingen. Aqua is Greek, Dingen, water things. It's German, and so it's a little weird. But they somehow figured that was the case, and so this is kind of a Shroud of Turin variant that this woman Veronica could see on the Via Dolorosa, the path of sorrows, where Jesus was carrying or following the cross, depending on which gospel you prefer, and he was stumbling, he was weak from being flogged, he was bloody, and so as a gesture of compassion, she took a linen cloth and wiped his face with it, leaving a miraculous imprint. I don't know about you, but if I wiped my face, no, coherent image is coming off it, right? And you might as well sponge it. Good luck. So this was an etiological story of some relic somebody had. Oh, it's the real thing, And just like we have modern versions of that, right, with this fraudulent shroud science, syndenology. Well, it really is the image of Jesus. It was made by an antimatter, this and that. Yeah, right. People would just love to believe they had such a thing. I mean, boy, I would love it if we did. No such luck, though. The ancient Greeks had the science available to invent photography. They just never put two and two together. Boy, what a pain that is, right? We do have a photo of one great religious founder, though, from the 19th century, Baha'u'llah. And it used to be that nobody could even look at that photo without going to Haifa, Israel, where they have a big international shrine. But now it's available on the internet, and he's a pretty impressive-looking guy. Anyhow, so Veronica is one. Another one is the Wandering Jew, who is given various names. There are loads of novels and legends about this guy. Sometimes they call him Cartaphilus, Heart of Love, because he repented. Sometimes they call him Batadeus, the one who beats God. Or sometimes... whoa, boy, well, there's a third major one. What the heck is it now? I think Ahasuerus, the same as Artaxerxes, the Persian emperor. I could be wrong, but I think that's right. And the legend is, again, Jesus is on the Via Dolorosa, not much fun, and the crowd is booing and jeering him, and foremost among these jerks is this guy, Ahasuerus, and he's saying, "Hey, speed it up, Jesus," and Jesus, and as one of the names implies, and one of them he hits Jesus. And Jesus turns to him, not in a very forgiving mood, and says, "Tarry thou till I come again." And as a result, this poor guy is stuck witnessing all the sorrows of the world, century after century, wanting to die, but it's impossible. He's been cursed with almost immortality, and he'll finally gain his rest when Jesus comes again. Now, what happens to him then? I don't really know if I've read that part of the story, right? Is he supposed to be damned? Or has he worked off his guilt? That would kind of make more sense the way these legends go. But he does repent in some of them, and there's some good science fiction stories about this, in fact. And of course, he, like Judas Iscariot, is like an allegorical symbol for the Jews. The idea that they made a big mistake crucifying Christ, and so that's why they're kicked out of their own homeland and have to wander perpetually, right? All that stuff. Kind of an interesting legend grew out of it, though. I mean, about the sufferings of how the Jews become a Christ figure, right? So it kind of backfired in a happy way, oddly enough. Okay, so I guess there are other ones too, but those are some of the biggies. Well, I love the way legend grows about the Bible. Okay, this is from Brian in Fort Collins, Colorado. It says, since the Yezidis have been in the news lately owing to their horrendous oppression at the hands of the Sunni Islamo-fascist ISIS, I have been reading about their fascinating religion and am interested in how its syncretic elements might shed light on the crucible of ideas that formed Judaism, Christianity, and Islam from earlier constituent parts. After reading a summary piece in Vice magazine that explained how their peacock angel savior deity, Melech Tus, identified with Satan, fell from heaven as in Judaic myth, but then was redeemed and restored to his place. O'Brien kindly sent me the link to the article, and it says that they believed he had fallen and so on, but that he wept in repentance for what he had done, and after 4,000 years he was forgiven and took his place in heaven again. Okay, let's see. I started wondering if we might consider him a dying and rising God. What else do you know about the Yazidi faith that has interesting things to tell us about the origins of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity? Well, I had never thought of him being a dying and rising God, but I guess that would qualify. It's like Baal and the others going down to Hades or the equivalent and coming back. I suppose you could consider him a dying and rising God. Fascinating. Good thinking. What else do we know about him? Well, it certainly fits in with apocalyptic thought, in that you, like in the first epistle of John, you have the world lies in the grasp of the evil one. That sums up nicely the two-age model of apocalyptic that says God is in de jure control of the world as its creator and sustainer, but he's not really de facto in control, because you can't tell me that this is the way God wants things to go, right? Look at all the wars and plagues and horrors and so on. That's what God wants? And they thought nah, that can't be. And apparently they borrowed this from Zoroastrianism, where they said, look, you can't tell me that a wise and good God is in control of this. I mean, if he is, he's not very good. If he's good, he can't be doing this. So they said God is constantly at war with the anti-God, Ahriman. And we know in the end he'll beat him and evil will be destroyed. But it's still going to take a while, and that's kind of how apparently the source of Jewish apocalyptic, which says, well, Satan is a fallen angel. He's not really a kind of evil twin of God, but in effect he is, right? The basic idea is the same. Because he must have power to act against God, because he's certainly doing it, and we'd certainly rather ascribe all this mischief to him rather than somehow square it with God and his justice. So basically they took this over from Zoroastrianism, and so this age is run by the devil. It's in his power, him and his fallen angels, the principalities and powers, and the shock troops, the demons who possess people. And but this is going to end this soon now. Like, it's not really worth talking about this unless you believe this awful reign of terror is soon to end. Otherwise, it's just depressing, right? But it's hopeful if you say, yeah, things look bad now, because they are bad now, but we're praying, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is now in heaven. And so this is what I think Peter Berger calls a future this world theodicy, that it's not really an explanation of how a good God can allow this, because any way you cut it, he's allowing it. I mean, again, this is the one big difference between Jewish apocalyptic and Zoroastrianism. God is doing what he can in the latter. But so he is all righteous, but not all powerful, or this stuff wouldn't be happening. He will be all powerful by default once he destroys the power of Ahriman, right? Well, Judaism couldn't say that God's power was limited. I think they still leave that implied, but they wouldn't want to say that as a piece of theology, so they didn't. So you'd still have to wonder, well, why is God allowing this? And there are possible answers. You could say, well, humanity has invited it, and they haven't proven themselves worthy to be saved from it yet. I think some Jewish thinkers suggested something like that. But Berger's point is, it doesn't really matter as long as it's going to stop soon, right? Then once the dead are raised and there's just rejoicing in heaven and the messianic banquet, hey, pass me a Leviathan leg. Who's going to care? Right, and you meet the guy that martyred you, Nero or something, up in well, no, you're not going to meet him. I guess that's if universalism was true. Forget that. But you're not going to really care. I mean, might as well let bygones be bygones. You're in the millennium, or you're in heaven, right? Yeah, the Yazidis, depending on how you interpret it, and I've read different sources about them. I've only recently read the notion that they believed Satan was redeemed and forgiven. Now, those who didn't think that, if there were any, I mean, I'm sort of at the mercy of the little bits I have available. If they believe Satan is still fallen, but in control of the world to such a degree that he's the one you have to deal with. And that's what I've always thought they believed. Again, I may be wrong. But if they think that, it's very much like many African religions where they believe the Creator got disgusted with the world and retreated from it, and you just can't contact him anymore. But he has left the world in the charge of subordinate deities. And of course, they may not be as powerful or as wise as the Creator, but that's all you've got to deal with. And in the same way, the Yazidis, as I have understood it, or misunderstood it, figure that Satan is in charge of this world, the peacock lord, the proud lord, right, is what they mean. You know, he fell from heaven because of his pride. He is in charge, and you'd better pay tribute and work with him. So that's why they're called devil worshippers. They're not like, sacrificing people and all that. Rather, it's just this canny resignation of that's the way the world is currently. So that's at least another version of the apocalyptic thought. Perhaps the most, I have some nasty things to say about women, unfortunately, and they say that the first woman, I guess they called her Eve, was actually barren, and the whole human race came from Adam, strangely. I mean, that's kind of pursuing the logic of Genesis 2, further, maybe even more consistently, where all mankind comes from Adam. Right, the first woman is born, one might say, from the first man. Well, the same sort of chauvinism. But my favorite bit of Yazidi theology has to do with the resurrection of Jesus, because they believe that Jesus somehow got the Father mad at him somehow, and he imprisoned him in a cave, and then Melech Tus took pity on him and released him. Well, you know what that is, don't you? That's a version of the resurrection in which it is Satan who raises Jesus from the dead. Now, I just think this is a great example of what structuralism says, that there are various options in the, literary criticism, maybe not structuralism in this case. There's a good book on what I was driving at there. Johann, good God, what's his name? Oh, boy, I'm losing it. Maybe it'll come to me later. The Tree of Gnosis, I think it's called. And he says that there's certain issues, perennial issues, that occur to the human mind, problems that are dealt with in all religions, and the same basic options are there, and they're combined in different ways in different religions or divisions of religion, so that sooner or later you're going to see the same kind of thing, like salvation by grace versus works versus synergism. You're going to have these debates again and again. You got them in Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and so on. Well, the same sort of thing would apply here with a resurrection story. There are different possibilities that can be put together differently. If you'll excuse a little pompous literary criticism, structuralists speak of a syntagmic axis in a story, where you've got a plot line, the developing plot logic. This kind of thing happens because of that one, and the problem that comes up will be resolved by the end of the story, and it might happen this way or that way, but there's generally an identifiable plot logic. That's the syntagmic axis, like the syntax of a sentence. But then there's also the paradigmatic axis, the paradigm, like your drop menu on a computer. Which option do you want to pick? And in this case, plug into the empty blanks of which the syntagmic axis is made. Okay, who's the protagonist going to be? A prince, a superhero, a detective, a spy, whatever. What challenge is he going to face? Does he have to rescue a princess, rescue his daughter, defeat the supervillain, defeat the agents of Thrush? What's it going to be? How's he going to do it? Is he going to have a weapon, some special weapon, a special skill? How's he going to get that? There'll be a donor character like Obi-Wan Kenobi or Merlin or whatever. So you can fill in the blank, and you can combine them any old way you want. And in fact, like Lester Dent, who wrote most of the Doc Savage pulp novels, he, before anybody came up with this fancy terminology, he had a storyboard with little flaps of paper that he could flip up and down along the plot line to determine how the basic plot would be reincarnated in every novel. And well, that's exactly what goes on in all novels. You got the syntagmic axis, the narrative syntax, and then you've got the paradigmatic axis, all these pull-down menus with the options. And I know I'm going way beyond what this question requires, but I think it's worth knowing, and it helps make my point. Who is going to raise Jesus? The syntax of the narrative is that Jesus is killed or swoons on the cross or disappears. Take your pick. He is entombed. Who did it? Why? Take your pick. Joseph of Arimathea, the women, who knows? Then how's he going to get out? God raises him from the dead. An angel pushes the boulder out of the way. And eventually somebody has to realize, well, you could have Satan. John says Jesus raised himself from the dead. The Yazidis said Satan did it. Well, pretty good. I mean, that had to come out somewhere, right? And so I just think their beliefs are very fascinating. They lost their scriptures for a good while, and some Western, American or English, I forget, student of these things still had translations of it, and I guess copies of their texts that were made generations ago, and he restored the Yazidi scriptures to the community that was without them. That is so fascinating that you kind of, just as an outsider, not even a member of the religion, you become a kind of Martin Luther for them. It's great stuff. But the Yazidis do deserve a lot of attention. They're a fascinating group. Ooh, let's see. Dane Butler from Australia says, on a previous episode, a fellow geek asked if the Vesuvius eruption in 79 CE could have possibly had a connection to Mac's Little Apocalypse or any other New Testament writings, and I wanted to know what your thoughts about Vesuvius being a basis for Revelation 8 are. I just don't know. I mean, there were a lot of eruptions back then, and Pliny the Elder died investigating the eruption of Vesuvius. He got a little too close. He was an intrepid reporter, but took a risk that didn't pay off once. I don't know. This is kind of like asking if the lightning and special effects at Mount Sinai might have denoted a volcano, one of the old rationalist explanations for that. I just don't really know because, you know, the Markan Apocalypse says there'll be earthquakes, etc. in various places. It's kind of generic and indefinite, and so the most you can really say is maybe. I mean, I suppose if they had Vesuvius specifically in mind, which they could have, there would have been more specifics, some kind of puns or descriptions or something, but hard to know. It's just that it's not that earthquakes and volcanoes were all that rare, so we just have to wonder. As far as I know, I welcome further enlightenment from anybody that knows any more about it. Let's see, this from our pal Lachlan Christiante. I have asked before if Lachlan is a male or a female, if that's his or her birth name, and what does Lachlan mean by being a vampire predator. Just a horror fiction fan, I'm one too, but here's the answer. First, before the bio, the standard disclaimer. Within contains fact and fancy, truth and metaphor, discriminate with care. Kind of like the Gospels. I'll try to make this short so we can go back to the interesting things right away. Since you expressed curiosity as to my gender and religion and have answered so many of my questions, I feel it only right to oblige. Like the monikers of many Bible geeks, Lachlan Christiante I'm adding an I here. Lachlan Cristante, is a pseudonym. Lachlan means man of the lakes, and Cristante is a pun both for anti-Christ and before Christ, like antebellum. Right? The man of the waters who was before Christ is John the Baptist. I found this character useful in understanding many of my experiences. I am male and I am a vampire. That is to say, I'm a member of the Temple of the Vampire. This is an initiatory secret society, although I prefer the term mystery religion. Of course, that is, as you're saying, exactly the same thing. That's what mystery means historically. A predator is a lay member who has validated certain aspects of the temple's teachings. As a lay member of a secret society, I'm not authorized to disclose or discuss any information about the temple, nor do I feel qualified to do so even if I were given permission. For anyone who wishes to obtain more information about the Temple of the Vampire, the public website address is vampiretemple.com, no spaces. My introduction to mythicism was back in the last decade of the 20th century. During a major family crisis, my family turned to religion. My mother went from secular humanism first to mainline Protestantism and then to Pentecostalism, but raised in the cultural background of Christianity, but without any exposure outside of weddings and baptisms. My experience of the numinous is different from most. That year, I was in a college course regarding the philosophy of God, where we went in detail into the various arguments regarding the God of the philosophers. When my mother gave me an apologetics book that proved every one of the flawed arguments for the existence of God correct in a meager 18 pages, I put the book down and started reading Michael Martin's The Case Against Christianity. It was a paradigm destroyer. Although he presented and dismissed a mythic Jesus after the first chapter, as he continued to argue against and then grant the various claims about Jesus, for example, the ability to raise himself and others from the dead and to work other miracles, I had to consider the idea of what Martin calls a resurrecting finite miracle worker. Someone who could do all of the things attributed to Jesus, but who was not in fact God. If I understand that right, by the way, if I can interrupt here, it's like, would Jesus have to be God, even if that stuff about him were true? Because it's not clear, right, that you would have to draw that inference. Okay. I've always had an interest in counter-apologetics, which led me to listening to The Thinking Atheist, but more on that later. That view of Jesus as possibly being a magician who tapped into the occult powers of the universe rather than being the universe's creator hung in the back of my mind when around 11 years ago I was reading a book entitled Witchcraft and Alchemy and watching the TNT adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot. The book discussed the witch's Sabbath as being not about faith but about a direct experience. The witches were in the presence of Satan and knew through their own senses that they were in the presence of a numinous being. When the priest, Father Callahan, confronted the vampire Barlow, he had the same numinous experience and telegraphed it to the audience with a question he asked, "Is there a God?" I joined the temple because I wanted to explore the possibilities myself, even if, like any red-blooded American, I would prefer the secrets of the universe handed to me on a silver platter, as per Matthew 14:8. Shortly after joining the temple, I obtained the book Vampires or Gods by William Myers. It is, in my opinion, the best introduction to mythicism, although it follows a bad mythicism paradigm of a direct conspiracy, rather than the organic mythicism of confusing a literary or metaphorical character with a historical figure. The book invokes Spinoza's conjecture that it is easier to accept a premise than to reject it, because one can only properly reject what one understands. The chapters are on Osiris and Isis, Cybele, Mithras, Dionysus, Hercules, Krishna, Romulus, Caligula, Quetzalcoatl, Jesus, Apollonius, Zhongling, and Dracula. By using the idea of a vampire, William Myers is able to draw parallels between all of the figures and then drops the secret when Jesus comes up. To quote, let me just differentiate. In all probability, Jesus Christ, worshipped as God by Christians, is the actual secondary model after Vlad the Impaler for the modern literary vampire. As many scholars have pointed out, Dracula is largely a parody of Christ and Christianity. It was written at a time when many intellectuals thought Christianity, which they thought of as wholesale superstition, would collapse under its own weight. I didn't give the issue much thought, though, until listening to The Thinking Atheist when you explained Matthew's genealogy. I was on the fence about actually taking the time to read through the Bible when Richard Dawkins told his readers it was in their best interest to be culturally literate people in the God delusion. But wanting to know that secret threw me into full study mode. My fiancée was already into Jesus studies as an author, although her experience has burned her out on anything that reminds her of her evangelical upbringing, to the point where she can't stand Seth Andrews' voice. That's pretty tough to do since he's got a great one. I don't think she's complained about yours. I'm thinking not, though, since your striking countenance didn't make an impression, despite me saying, you know, that guy from that Da Vinci Code documentary we bought from the dollar store, and from the God Who Wasn't There with the leonine hair and beard. Thank you, Lachlan. Fascinating. Very fascinating. So my curiosity about the historical Lachlan is satisfied. Let's see now. This is also from Lachlan, a different question from a different day. I recently filed my taxes, and as my mother died on April 15th, her death and taxes are forever linked in my mind. There were 2 questions of a biblical nature that I asked her as a child and then mostly forgot about until it was too late to ever ask her again, but perhaps you can weigh in on her opinions. Around 1980, I asked her what 1980 was and not some other number. She told me about Anno Domini reckoning, and naturally I had a question about why New Year's and Christmas are a week apart. Her answer was that Jesus was born on the night of Christmas Eve because of how Jews measure the day starting at sundown. He was circumcised on January 1st, and that's why it's New Year's Day. Creative answer to a silly question or established tradition? She may have been told this, who knows, but that really isn't why that is. Let's see, the thing with New Year's, actually there's something like what she said if you're asking about why Christmas is different in the Eastern churches versus Roman Catholic and Protestant churches. That has to do with the difference between Christmas and Epiphany, because when Western churches are celebrating Epiphany on January 6th, Eastern churches are celebrating Christmas, and this has to do with the fact somewhere along the line that December 25th and January 6th, according to different ancient calendars, were the winter solstice, and that kind of coincides with Brumalia, the annual birthday of the sun god Mithras, when the days begin to get longer again, right? So, excuse me. And but New Year's Day, I think I'm not sure where they get that except that it's the first day of the first month of the Roman calendar. But I don't know that it has any other significance than that. But I don't, though New Year's festivals were real big in the biblical world, like in the Old Testament. Rosh Hashanah, as we call it now, was the New Year, and it was an autumn festival. And it became the year when the day of the year when the kingship was renewed, reenacting the enthronement of the god who secured his place as the head of the pantheon by killing the chaos dragon and creating the world and all that. That sort of drained out of Western civilization. But the Anno Domini thing, of course, that was the rather late creation of the monk Dionysius Exiguus, Dennis the Short. He tried to figure out when Jesus would have been born based on whatever clues he could come up with out of the nativity stories and Josephus and so on. And so there is no year zero, by the way. There's just one BC, or now we call it BCE, and then it flips over to 1 AD or CE, Common Era. BCE before the Common Era, right? And so there's no year zero. But he made a mistake that people recognized later. He didn't notice that Herod the Great tells his goon squad to skewer all the Bethlehem babies who were born up to 2 years before, which implies that that's when it says he got that information from asking the wise men when they saw the natal star appear. So it was 2 years before. Well, Herod died in 2 BCE, I believe. And so that... is that right? Or is it 4? But at any rate, they should have had when Jesus was born, or 2 years before he was born, depending on how you want to take that. Up to 2 years old. Did the star appearing mean that Jesus had been born, or that he was being born now, or that he would be born soon? Right? There's that ambiguity in the whole sighting of the star. So they've since figured that going by that, but keeping the numbering, you would have to say Jesus was born between 4 and 6 BCE. Then there are other debates, more or less plausible, as to what time of year Jesus was born. And I don't think there's any way to determine what the story implies. And that's really all we can go on. Who knows if there was a Jesus to be born? Okay, the other question I asked her was about vampires, although now I have the adult understanding that there is no first member of any species. As a child, I think I even knew about Adam and Eve, or wasn't worried about humans, but as vampires seem to spread by bites, I wondered where the first vampire came from. She told me about Lilith, who decades later I discovered was appointed to fill that role. Do you know when this idea became part of pop culture? And is the reference to her in Isaiah retrofitted to be a name, or is it the translation into screech owl, or is the translation as screech owl in the King James a deliberate obfuscation? I don't know if it was a deliberate obfuscation, or if they simply didn't know enough about the relevant mythology to recognize what they were dealing with. But I think Lilith was already a well-established demoness in Mesopotamian mythology, and that's what Isaiah is talking about. She was the ancient explanation for sudden infant death syndrome, or crib death, where you don't know why, but an infant dies, stops breathing in the cradle, and they figured, well, it must be this demon who is sucking the breath out of them, so they and eventually she was also drafted to explain another problem by the rabbis. I mean, they had no trouble believing there were such beings, right? They had Agrath, the queen of the demons, and stuff like that. They said, wait a minute, in Genesis 1, doesn't it say that God made them male and female in the beginning? It said, be fruitful and multiply. But then in chapter 2, we've got the man, the male, created, and then only later the female? Well, what's going on there? They figured it was all written by Moses. It was one continuous story. Of course, we don't think so anymore. But they said, well, then how do what could have happened to have these two developments emerge? There must be something behind the scenes, behind the curtain, that would reconcile them. And they said, all right, the reference to creating the male and female right out of the gate, that must have been Adam and Lilith. And she was proud and uppity, and finally left Adam. She refused to be subordinate to him, and she went and took up with Samael, another name for the devil or the fallen angel. And then to replace her, God made Eve, who was sort of a Stepford wife. Well, pretty creative. That's again like those stories about the wandering Jew and all that. It's sort of an interesting legend barnacle on the biblical story. This is still the same email. On a recent Bible Geek, there was a suggestion that boiling a kid in its mother's milk could be a reference to boiling a ruminant's rennet, R-E-N-N-E-T, in its mother's milk rather than boiling meat. This makes an intuitive sense if you look at the fall from Eden, from the paradigm of going from a hunter-gatherer to an agricultural existence. While the nomadic herder can extract milk, making cheese takes time. One of the odder implications of this paradigm is that the problem with alcohol isn't chemical but cultural, as making alcoholic beverages also takes time. Despite food taboos in religion, I don't think a food-based view of spirituality or a spiritual-based view of food has really been explored beyond a few books such as Marvin Harris's Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches, and one of my all-time favorites, Cannibals and Kings, also by the same author. Yeah, I've not read any of those books, I'm sorry to say. Although on the criteria of building a hedge around the Torah, often discussed on the Bible Geek regarding taking the Lord's name in vain, Christopher Hitchens made some interesting observations that the proscription on pork may be an outgrowth of a proscription on eating people. Yeah, that's a new one on me. I kind of prefer Woody Allen's explanation in his Hasidic Tales, where there's a procession to the synagogue in an Eastern European town, and to commemorate the high holy day that commemorates God's reneging on all of his promises to Israel. I think that is a great excuse for a holiday. We ought to celebrate it. And suddenly a woman cries out to the Rebbe, "Why are we not allowed to eat pork?" Or maybe I should say, "Why are we not allowed to eat pork?" And the rabbi says, "We're not? Uh-oh." And then the commentator says, some think that the prohibition against eating pork originally simply said not to eat pork in certain restaurants. But who knows? Okay, thanks, Man of the Lakes. Jay says, can you provide a recap of books of the New Testament where multiple books have or are purported to have the same author, and is that actually the case? For example, the Gospel of John and the Apocalypse of John, or the Book of Revelation, and John 1 and John 2 in the epistles. Are all of those supposed to be the same John in the standard explanation of, say, the Catholics? Now, I do realize that the Gospel of John is known not actually to have been written by John, quote-unquote. Putting that aside, if all these books cannot be written by the same person, what is the basis for knowing that they cannot be? Such as an impossible spread of time between of publication between the various books? Good questions. John is a great example. For one thing, the epistles of John do not have an author's name, right? Just an epithet or a title, the elder. And of course, First John doesn't even have that. It looks like somebody, I would guess Polycarp, decided he needed some non-Pauline apostolic epistles to balance off the Marcionite canon with its exclusive Pauline selection of epistles. And so there were these two pseudepigraphical books, 1st and 2nd Peter. There was a book written by somebody named James and somebody named Jude, and he figured, well, maybe those the James and Jude are the ones we read about in the book of Acts and so on. Or 1st and 2nd Peter, well, let's assume they're actually by Simon Peter. But with John, it was sort of gratuitous. I mean, John is another famous apostolic name beside James and Peter, so why not attribute them to him? So they become 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, I believe, written in reverse order. I've expanded on that before. Now, whoever wrote them. Now, the book of Revelation is supposedly written by somebody named John. Although, if it, as Benjamin Bacon once said, if that apocalypse actually names its real author, it's the only one that's not pseudonymous. And so you'd have to wonder if maybe that is pseudepigraphical too, as I sort of think. But even if it is, I mean, there are plenty of guys named John. Eusebius didn't like the content of the Gospel of John. He believed in amillennialism, as we now call it. There's not going to be a literal millennium, and the book of Revelation pretty well says there is. And so many ancient churchmen thought Revelation was a lot of nonsense and didn't want it in the canon. Well, and he said, well, John the Apostle, John son of Zebedee, couldn't have written this piece of junk. Hey, doesn't Papias mention a John the disciple of the Lord, and then a couple of lines later, the elder John, as if they're two different guys? Sure, that's it. That's the ticket. The book of Revelation was written by John the Elder. Well, some people continue that distinction today, but they tend to say John son of Zebedee would be more likely the author of the Apocalypse, because the Greek is not that great, and John son of Zebedee would have been an uneducated Galilean fisherman, and that's the kind of Greek we could guess he would write. Yeah, that makes some sense, but there's no way to know. Now, is there actually a connection between the Gospel, the Epistles, and the Apocalypse? There might be, but because they do have certain things in common. You have to be totally oblivious to read 1 John and not keep thinking that you're reading the Gospel of John. Oh yeah, right, this is the epistle, not the Gospel. There's so much in common, turns of phrase, vocabulary, ideas, that it used to be taken for granted, and reasonably so, that the three letters and the Gospel were by the same person. But then folks started pointing out some kind of jarring differences, and that the idea that the Antichrist had already come, and things like this. And this also, it gets even murkier because of the apparent redaction of the Gospel of John by Bultmann's ecclesiastical redactor. I would say that's Polycarp. And it looks like that the original draft was Gnostic and had realized eschatology. You know, there's not going to be any end-of-the-world fireworks. The new world has come now if you only have eyes to see it. And Polycarp has added futuristic, predictive, eschatology and doctrine of the future in there. Originally it says, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Well, in other words, this is it. You're not going to see any actual people coming out of their graves. It's a spiritual resurrection. But then a few verses down, it suddenly says, the hour is coming, and then it pointedly does not say, and now is, when the dead in their graves, so we're actually talking about corpses, will hear and come forth to face the judgment about their works and all that. So there's these things that look like they're attempts to re-eschatologize it. So that raises the question, is it possible that the epistles of John were written by the same person who redacted the Gospel of John? Well, you'd still have to ask, why do they sound so much alike? Well, that is because of the Johannine school of thought. It's very obvious reading 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John that there was a schism within a missionary fellowship, circuit-riding so-called brethren who went around teaching and prophesying and so forth, and that there had been a split because some of them had become docetic Gnostics, denying that Jesus Christ had come in the flesh and stuff like that. They went out from us, but they never really were a part of us, or they'd have stayed where they were. So there's a schism, and you know that even a church denomination is going to have certain cliche phrases that they use that others don't. That's certainly true with philosophical schools. And so it appears you had a kind of Johannine school that split. So you're going to have different writings by different factions that are still going to sound much the same in style. And that probably explains why the Gospel of John is not written by the writer, whoever he was, of the epistles of John, though the secondary layer of the Gospel may have been. Now, what about the book of Revelation? Well, there are a couple of links. You've got the same pun between word and lamb. Because Jesus is called the Word of God and the Lamb of God in both the Gospel of John and the Apocalypse of John. That may, plus the work is sent to 7 churches. Now that kind of sounds like the arrangement presupposed in the epistles of John, where some elder oversees a group of churches and sends out preachers, prophets, etc., to make the rounds of them. So I'm guessing this came out of that same community. But beyond just the pun, the word and the lamb in Hebrew, the underlying Hebrew, it's written in Greek, but in Hebrew the words look very similar. It makes me think that somewhere along the line you have a different member of the community writing and a different genre, and this is the result. But that there is a kind of a link there, less close than that between the Gospel and the epistles. One final link on that, obviously, the Apocalypse of John has futuristic eschatology and is concerned with the 2 antichrists, the beast and the false prophet. Well, that's just like in 1 John. Little children, you heard the antichrist was going to come. Well, many have shown up. This is a Sopranos episode where they're talking about the mistreatment of Italians in American history. They're talking about Sacco and Vincente, I forget that, can't get that straight. And AJ says, what about these guys, the 2 antichrists? And his sister Meadow says, that's anarchist. There can't be 2 antichrists. But I beg to differ. Behemoth and Leviathan. And at any rate, so yeah, there is some kind of connection, or at least it's pretty reasonable to think so, pretty tempting to think so. But they're not written by the same person. At least it would be very surprising. You have a similar thing with the pseudonymous Pauline epistles. Some sound more alike than others, like the four Hauptbriefe, or principal epistles, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. They have more in common stylistically and conceptually than they do with Colossians and Ephesians and Philippians, which have more Gnostic, a Gnostic tinge to them, and so on down the line. And this is generally explained by later stages of evolution within the Pauline community. And who was that? Well, initially Marcionites and Gnostics, and then eventually Roman Catholics tried to co-opt these epistles by padding them out, and so you have a connection of sorts, but not really the same author. Another interesting issue here: were Luke and Acts written by the same person? It's almost universally said that they were, and there's a lot of good reason to think so. But you have to explain the anomaly that in Acts there are synonyms consistently used for things that appear in Luke with the other synonym, right? Why would the same author switch vocabulary on unimportant matters? So that's the choice of a synonym, and especially if there's a pattern to it, seems to imply a mark of a writer, and very different than different writers. There are some conceptual differences too, and here's what I think is the basic ground plan of the solution to this. It appears that our canonical Luke is a much edited and padded out version of a shorter gospel. We don't know who supposedly would have been the author, but the Marcionites used that, just called it the gospel. And Polycarp, probably the same guy, the ecclesiastical redactor, added considerable to make it amenable to a Catholic readership. Then, when you get to Acts, it appears that Polycarp adopted an Aramaic story of the Jerusalem church and the introduction of Paul, and this would have been the basis of our Acts chapters 1 through 15. It was in Aramaic. C.C. Torrey called that First Acts, because he says what we're reading in Greek kind of sounds like translation Greek, with an underlying Hebraic structure, like the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. But it doesn't sound like translation Greek when you get to chapter 16 and on to the end of the book. There, it sounds like free composition in Greek. And so, putting all this together, I think the man who padded out the original, shorter basis of Luke translated this Aramaic First Acts into Greek and then wrote Second Acts, as Torrey calls it. And that explains the vocabulary differences and so on. I'm going to get into this much more in the Luke Acts chapter that I happen to be working on now for the Holy Fable book. But this goes even farther, because a very good case has been made, and I go into this a bit in my in the pre-Nicene New Testament, the Human Bible New Testament, and perhaps my favorite of my books, the Widow Traditions in Luke Acts, the case for common authorship of the pastoral epistles and Luke and Acts. It's also the vocabulary, conceptuality, even quotes from the same sources, seems to me to secure that pretty well. There was in effect a kind of Lucan canon, or Polycarpian canon, right, of Luke, Acts, and the pastorals. But it's also been suggested that the same author may have written Hebrews, There's not as much similarity, but there is some striking similarity in it, and I wouldn't rule that out. That certainly could be. Well, I guess that's probably more than you wanted to know about that, but it's a very good question, and it is an important issue in New Testament criticism. Let's see. Jonathan says, while I was cooking lunch at my mother's house, I was reminded of the Jewish dietary prescriptions in Leviticus 11. I remembered back when I was around 9 or 10, a relative of mine who was attending the United Methodist Church showed me this passage and asked me why Christians like us are eating pork. My mother back then cooked pork for dinner, and I told her that we shouldn't be eating it, for it is unclean. So I was only eating beef and vegetables for a week. Back then I was studying in a Catholic school, and I brought this concern to a seminarian. He explained it then to me that Jesus makes it clear that it is not what we eat that makes us unclean, but what comes out. Words and deeds. Mark 7:18 through 23. Then there's the contradiction with 1 Timothy 4:3, which the RSV translates to, who forbid marriage and enjoin abstinence from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. The King James, however, translates it as forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats. Is it possible that the Mark passage is a reflection of the Gnostic dietary laws? If the pastorals are not written by Paul, why is it not in harmony with the Mark passage? Very good questions. I tell you, geeks are pretty sharp-eyed. What the 1 Timothy passage is aiming at is the Encratites, which overlap with Marcionites and Gnostics. Encratite spirituality was the gospel of celibacy, that the original sin was sexual, and that's what gave rise to the bickering, warring human race, and that we want to undo that one day by freeing the divine spark from the crude body of flesh and having it wing its way back to the divine pleroma of light. And in the meantime, you shouldn't have kids, because that's just imprisoning more souls, making them captive to the demiurge who created the material world. And so they said if you wanted to be saved, you had to swear off sex, even within marriage. And this is the gospel preached in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, Acts of John, Paul, Philip, so on and so on, Peter, Thomas. And Dennis MacDonald, in his terrific little book, The Legend and the Apostle, The Battle for Paul in Story and Canon, he goes into this and just totally convinces me. So that's what that's dealing with: vegetarianism and celibacy, anarchism, apocalypticism, and various aspects that went together in the Encratite communities of Asia Minor. All right, Revelation seems to participate in that. The 144,000 are men who have kept themselves pure, and they are, it says, they are parthenoi, they are virgins who have not defiled themselves with women. You see what that means, right? To have sex at all is defilement from the standpoint of the Encratites. Encratite from enkrateo, self-control, meaning sexual continence. Okay, so that's what that's about. In Mark, you have this idea that it's like an anti-ceremonial polemic. It's saying, really, what the heck difference does it make what you eat? That can't render you unclean in any meaningful sense. What does is immoral thoughts and actions that come out of someone's heart, not what goes into their stomach. And then Mark has a comment on that, which could be translated either as, thus he declared all foods clean. That's not only a legitimate translation, but a legitimate inference, if that's what Mark is saying. But it could also mean and thus it goes into the latrine. That all foods are rendered clean since they wind up in the toilet bowl anyway. Sorry about that, Victoria. She's eating cereal out of a bowl. I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, so what that sounds like a kind of Marcionite view, a rejection of all the kosher laws. And it may well have been, but it could be full-on Gnosticism, because it kind of sounds like what Paul condemns in 1 Corinthians, or is it 7, one of the early chapters, where it says, I know what some of you are saying, sex is no different from fulfilling the bodily need for food. Food for the body for food. Right, and then further on, people that are just treating the communion table like an all-you-can-eat buffet that's just food to them. And whereas Paul's saying, hey, I wouldn't do that. You're taking your life into your hands. God could be striking you down for that. And so this would be an anti-sacramental view that he links with these Corinthian Gnostics, and the Mark 7 thing may be a piece of that Gnostic tradition. Sure, wouldn't be too surprising, right? Let's see now. Of course, in Colossians and various other Pauline, or supposedly Pauline letters, there is this idea that all the ceremonial laws of the Torah were aimed at preserving the ethnic and therefore religious identity of Jews, of Israel, because food creates cultural barriers, right? I remember the time after a doctoral dissertation defense at Drew, a bunch of Korean students asked me to go out to eat with them, which I was honored to do, but I really am not... I'm such a neurotically picky eater that I can't bring myself to eat vegetables even, and you can imagine what's on the menu at Thai restaurant we went to. I had a hard time eating or pretending to eat that food, and I hope it didn't offend them. So yeah, different menus will make it hard for people to associate, and that was the whole idea. And so Pauline Christianity says, hey, look, we want to break those walls down. In Christ, there's no more Jew or Gentile. And so he says that those laws are over with. Colossians says, don't let anybody give you grief about you mustn't eat this, you mustn't touch that, you better keep this Sabbath ritual and all that. No, you don't have to do that. So in the interest of that, there is the standard Christian view that go ahead and eat shrimp, go ahead and have a ham sandwich. I mean, if you're a Jewish Christian, you might still want to keep that marker of your heritage going, and that's okay, but you don't have to do it, especially if you weren't raised that way, if you're a Gentile Christian. And so that's the basis on which that whole thing is wiped away. That Christ has come to abolish the ceremonial, though not the moral law. Of course, almost all of the Torah is not moral law anyway. Let's see. Yeah, so good stuff. Here's one more from our old pal Karim Gantus. Yeah, that's him, yeah. Scroll down first to find out who I'm reading, and he requests a particular accent. In Luke 23:50 through 53, the author tells of when Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. The same story, more or less, is written in Matthew 27:57 through 60. Luke reads thusly: And behold, there was a man named Joseph, a counselor, and he was a good man and a just. The same had not consented to the counsel and deed of them. He was of Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who also himself waited for the kingdom of God. This man went unto Pilate and begged the body of Jesus. And he took it down and wrapped it in linen and laid it in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never a man before was laid. So that's Luke, right? And here's Matthew. When the even was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus' disciple. He went to Pilate and begged the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre, and departed. My main question has to do with historicity. Both accounts tell the same story, but with different wording. In other words, we have the same event that seems to come from two separate, independent oral traditions. If this is so, can we say that this is evidence for an early belief? I also note that in Luke's account, Joseph is a disciple of Jesus. In Matthew, he is not. Most curious. Okay, Actually, I don't think we have tradition variants here. We just have rewrites of Mark. Matthew and Luke often tell but augment the story that Mark gives, and I think that's all that's happened here. But the differences about Joseph of Arimathea are sort of, what would you say, they're glosses. They're attempts to clarify the story when it's confusing, because Mark does not give any hint that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, or that he abstained from the verdict of the Sanhedrin. He just leaves it to the reader's imagination, and it's not really that odd. The idea, let's assume, since Mark says they all voted that he was guilty and should be executed, right? Let's assume Mark thought Joseph voted for the condemnation of Jesus. But he had a horror of having Jews, their bodies exposed. I mean, it was a huge thing in ancient Judaism to see to the burial of the indigent dead, people that had no one to bury them, and presumably criminals and so on. We often hear that Gehenna was a garbage dump where the bodies of those who could not merit a burial in sacred ground were dumped, but apparently there's no real evidence for that, archaeological or otherwise. So look at the book of Tobit. That's all about the good deed of seeing to the burial of the dead who have no one else to bury them. So it's not that odd that even if he had thought Jesus was a false prophet, that he would want him to receive decent burial. But, looking at it as a kind of a story of our hero and all of that, and everybody in it being a kind of a sacred character, you have people trying to explain this in a more amenable way, and by amenable I mean amenable. We start hearing that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus secretly, and that he was on the Sanhedrin, but he didn't vote that way, and stuff like that. These are just attempts to iron out a perceived oddity in the story, and again, I don't even think it's that odd. So I don't think the Markan thing is a contradiction, but it's pretty obvious that Luke and Matthew are contradicting one another. Well, I know there are ways of wiggling out of it, but they seem to have just winged it and in different directions. And one last one. John Brockman says, okay, so apparently there was supposed to be two messiahs, son of David, son of Joseph or something. That's right. Let me just, can you explain that briefly? Actually, there are a couple of different two Messiah ideas that we know of from the New Testament period, or give or take a couple of centuries. One was the David and Joseph thing. One was that there would be, in the end time, there would be two warrior messiahs, let's make that clear, anointed kings, or at least warriors, who would carry the banner and fight for a restoration of Jewish independence. There would be one from the north, Messiah ben Joseph, Messiah son of Joseph. Remember, Joseph was the great patriarch of the northern tribes. The prominence he has in Genesis, he gets way more space than anybody else, and this must have been like a national hero epic up north, and his Joseph's sons beget the half-tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, and Joseph is born to rule his brothers, right? So this is all composed by somebody in the north that figured, our guys, our tribes will rule all the others. Whereas they were telling a different story with the Davidic stories where Judah is number one. Okay, so they believed that a northern Messiah ben Joseph, would fight the pagans and die in battle because of the sins of Israel. Now, it's a stock piece of theological furniture that the big thing that was stopping God from sending the Messiah to liberate Israel was the unworthiness of Israel. If Jews would just keep one lousy Sabbath perfectly, that'd be enough. And God would send the Messiah. Well, this is a variation on that theme, that they weren't exactly worthy yet, but the death of the heroic Messiah ben Joseph in battle with the pagans, that defeat was enough to atone for the sins of Israel, whereupon Messiah ben David, the destined king of the line of David to renew the dynasty, he would then pick up the fallen banner and lead his fellow Jews to victory and independence, and that would be the Messianic age. Where'd they get that idea? Well, I've just suggested it fits into various other ideas about end-time redemption, but I'm pretty sure it was Geza of Hermesh that came up with a brilliant theory. We don't actually hear about this until the 3rd century. That doesn't mean the idea was not older, but we don't know if it was older. It might well have been. But Vermesh said, by the 3rd century, I mean the 200s, Vermesh said, well, suppose they got the idea based on what happened to Simon Bar Kokhba, the Messiah who actually did get independence for Judah for about a year, and his rebellion was like 132 to 135, and there's some good reason to think that he even rebuilt the temple on some scale. He minted coins with his name on it, and it was looking pretty good, but of course, once Rome decided they'd had enough of it, that was it. And they rededicated the temple to Jupiter, and Simon Bar Kokhba was killed. But he was no deceiver of Israel. He wasn't some false prophet. And they needed some way to... they didn't want to just say, well, I guess we backed the wrong horse. I guess he was no Messiah. A lot of people just couldn't say that. He was a hero. And so they said, well, how about this? Maybe there's to be 2 Messiahs, and this man was the first one, and he had to die to make it possible for the second one to do the trick and carry it through. That is really brilliant, I think. But then again, we're not really sure. But that might be where it came from. It's not attested earlier than the 200s. Could be earlier. Okay, the other 2 Messiah model is that which is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it speaks of a messianic meal, which I think was like a repeated communion meal, anticipating the great messianic banquet. There would preside 2 messiahs, a priestly and a royal messiah. The priestly messiah is no doubt the high priest, either whoever the Qumran high priest was at the time, or some great figure to come. Messiah, son of Aaron, or the Messiah of Aaron. Yeah, Yeah, Messiah of Aaron, I believe it is. And then there would be the Messiah of David, and he would be the conventional righteous king. Now, some scholars think that, because it's not that clear, some of them think that, no, it really is two ways of discussing the same single Messiah. Could be, for all I know. But it gets even messier than that, because there's some reason in the scrolls to think that they believe the teacher of righteousness, who was kind of their founder or at least reformer, who taught them the Pesher method of scripture interpretation, that he, having been ambushed and murdered by the priestly establishment of Jerusalem, would one day come back to gain revenge on his murderers, sort of a second coming. There are also, like the various texts in Qumran, suggesting that the archangel Michael or Melchizedek, if they're not the same guy, are going to come back and during the final battle with evil. So, who knows? Any way you look at it, you've got a whole mess of pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, or maybe more than one puzzle, and it's very difficult to get the right ones together in the right combination. Boy, oh boy. But that's what makes it all fun. In fact, I think of all those poor guys who were trying to put together the little postage stamp fragments of some of the scrolls. That's bad. I mean, that's even worse, I guess, but even with the intact texts, it's almost the same kind of thing, trying to connect the dots and figure out, is there a coherent, overarching view here? And I don't know if it does. But John goes on to say, does this explain why early and some modern Christians so love John the Baptist? Was he recast as one of the two? Well, there are scholars who think that's the early Christian conception. I think, what's his name? Tuttle? Oh, boy, it's something like that, who wrote a commentary on Luke. He believed that the parallel nativity stories of John and Jesus stemmed from some group that thought that they were the priestly and kingly messiahs. That would make some sense, though my guess is that is an attempt to harmonize the two sects and to get them to merge. Then John says, does this perhaps explain the confused genealogies of Jesus, trying to cast him as both the messiahs simultaneously, through descent from both a Dave and a Joe? Could be, because Luke certainly does have more Levitical names, loads of them. Mattathias, Mathat, a whole bunch of versions of that, and Eli, and this and that and the other thing. Whereas you don't have that in the Matthean genealogy. But since those two are probably not intended to be read together, if anything, you might have Luke's genealogy, whatever he made of it, once he included it, maybe he was thinking of Jesus as the Levitical Messiah. Oh yeah, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs also speak of a Messiah from David and a Messiah from the tribe of Levi. So that's another one, yeah. And but Luke generally is speaking of Jesus as the son of David. And but there's some confusion, because in the Nunc Dimittis, is it the one of the canticles sung by Zechariah, he's saying how that his son John the Baptist is of the house of David. What the heck? So there's some kind of confusion. I don't know how to connect the dots on that. And finally, John says, does this feed into the second coming? Trying again to cast Jesus as both messiahs by saying he'd come back. Well, in Hebrews it says something like that, because Jesus is now the heavenly priest. Though not Levitical, he has inherited the greater priesthood of Melchizedek, so he's a heavenly high priest. I mean, if that's not a priestly Messiah, I don't know what is. But he's going to come back in judgment. So, maybe he did. I mean, I would say that's probably a pretty good way of putting the Christology of Hebrews. Even where they wouldn't have said that about Jesus, the New Testament writers kind of approach it, at least, when they have the notion that, okay, I guess Jesus didn't do the Davidic thing when he was here, but he does have to do it, doesn't he? Okay, he'll come back soon and wrap that aspect of it up. But don't worry, he was the Messiah doing his messianic thing when he was on earth originally. But it was to be an atonement for sin, and again, you're talking in priestly language. So I'd say implicitly that does kind of underlie the what became the majority Christian view. They don't quite come out and say it, but it does kind of fall along those lines, it seems to me. Okay, one more. William Alter. He says, if, as you have persuaded me, the canonical Pauline epistles were heavily interpolated, why did Marcion seemingly not have access to the originals, or do you think he did? There's a little bit of a hair to split here. It's difficult to know what Marcion himself did versus his followers, and I think it may be his followers that put together this canon, and that he wrote Galatians chapters 3 through 6, that is, which reflect his own attempt to be recognized in Rome, and brought a money offering that was turned back. It kind of sounds like Acts and Paul. But the Marcionites did apparently have the original shorter versions. And there's a great book you ought to read, The First New Testament, by Jason Bedune. That is capital B, small e, capital D, small U-H-N, Bedune. He did a terrific book also called Truth in Translation, comparing various New Testament versions and how there's a lot of surprising fudging going on. But this is a more massive work where he examines all the patristic material in greater detail than I think anybody, including Harnack, ever did, and he reconstructs what the Marcionite originals would have been. So I think he did have those. Okay, well, I guess that's it for tonight. We've been at it nearly a couple hours here. That deals with some of our questions. I still have lots more, and would appreciate lots more on top of that. So keep sending them in, all you extremely smart, sharp-eyed Bible geeks. So I will see you soon for another exciting episode, and thanks for being with me on this one. Sayonara.